Hi, I'm Jacob Jagger, and welcome to Suited for IoT, Episode 3. Today, we'll be covering the Internet of Commerce, or content. And as you'll remember from last time, we began with the discovery of radio waves and telephony and SMS specifically. This continued to develop, but we didn't see much innovation outside of the standard human-to-human connection until the late 50s, early 60s. And this began essentially as a consequence of the Cold War in 1958. There was a joint collaboration between the United States and Canada. At the time, there was quite a lot of concern, specifically from the US, about an attack that would come from the USSR over the North Pole. And this required a defense network to be established. And this agreement that was put together between Canada and America was known as the North American Aerospace Defense Command, or NORAD. For any of those of you that have seen Stargate, you would probably recognize it. It is the base that is located in Cheyenne Mountain and is the feature piece for the set for Stargate, at least Stargate SG-1, which is the best season. A critical component of this was the automated system that was put in place for NORAD. NORAD stationed hundreds of satellites and radio detection systems all across the Arctic. And this was to detect those potential attacks from the USSR. They were scattered across North America. The difficulty was twofold. The first one, how do we get the information from those satellites? How do we actually detect what is being transmitted and how that communication is taking place? But then also, how do we get it to NORAD, deep within Cheyenne Mountain? That's a difficult process because you can't exactly punch a radio wave through a mountain. It was in the mountain for a reason. At the same time, you also need to be able to interpret all of the information that is coming out of those satellites and out of those detection systems. Now, those detection systems themselves, they were communicating on radio or by physical cable. The clever bit, and the piece that changed the world as we know it today irrevocably, was the automation component. All of this information was fed into computer systems possibly as big as this room, with capacitors that you could hold. And in a very short amount of time, that information was processed and then delivered to an operator who could then interpret what was actually happening. Was it a bird? Was it a plane? Was it an international continental ballistic missile? And how would we respond to that? And that transformed the way that we thought about communication. It was no longer human to human. It was, in a sense, machine to machine, just a different type of machine to machine that we know in the 2020s in IoT. And we're going to cover that in a future episode. Ultimately, this led to the birth of the internet. And a lot of engineers started to look at what NORAD was doing with this communication framework and started to think about how that could be applied into the real world to be used by you and I, as opposed to just for defense purposes. And that very quickly and rapidly spread through first the universities, and then this went public and international a few decades later. This was the rise and the advent of what we would essentially consider WWW and being able to interface with the internet. And then we mentioned that we consider this era the internet era of commerce. And this was because we saw the rise as a consequence of businesses and communication being able to take place outside of your traditional telephone calls or Morse code communication. This led to a whole new form of business. Now we weren't just communicating over radio waves, and we weren't just using it to report the changes of stock. We were using it for defense, but we were also using it for commerce. We were using it for email. We were using it for retail. And one of the large innovations was also the ability to be able to use this new technology for entertainment. And this was when we started to see, especially in the 80s, the first websites being developed and designed. The critical part here is automated. And this was what truly revolutionized the second era of the internet. It was that automation component. And that was made possible by many innovations. To name one, the innovations we saw that came out of Bletchley Park that led to the very first computer. This became a machine-to-machine communication that brought us out of that human-to-human era of documents to what was essentially a true automated process. You no longer had a full interaction from a human perspective in understanding the data and then translating it. It could be processed and delivered to a human through that automation. And that was the flashpoint that led us to ultimately the birth of the internet. We saw the rise of the email and the first emails being sent. We saw a boom in technology and entertainment and communication that was taking place as a consequence of that as well. This then rapidly enabled us to advance, moving out of the 1970s and towards today. And we're going to cover that piece next, the Internet of Applications, where we saw the real first services and applications arise as a consequence of developments within this cellular history, but then also within the technology history as well. So stay tuned for the next episode of Suited for IoT.